Hello, everybody, and welcome to this month's edition of the Seekers Forum. I hope you're having a very good Sunday. And let's say hi to Jay Copley. How are you, Jay?
Hello, Mark. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Welcome. So, this month we are looking at crazy wisdom, the crazy wisdom path, and what it means to be a holy fool. Now, in July, we looked at the middle way. So I thought that it would be interesting this month to look at more extreme modes of spiritual practice and initiation, which also have their place in the landscape of human awakening. Crazy wisdom is a time honored practice that uses often bizarre, unsettling modes and tools to help people see the non duality of experience. So, what do we mean by crazy wisdom? Crazy wisdom refers to any teaching style that relies on unconventional, outrageous, unexpected, or unpredictable behavior that shakes us out of our ego delusions. Crazy wisdom teachers challenge our common sense views of reality and norms of conduct. In order to communicate spiritual truths and help people toward awakening, they shock cognitive boundaries and jolt moral sensibilities using radical eccentricity, trickery, and excess. Now, we find examples of holy fools, tricksters, boundary crossers, mad saints throughout history. You see them in Hinduism, in Hellenism, in Buddhism, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and shamanism. All of these paths use crazy wisdom methods and archetypes in their spiritual practices. The ancient Greeks called it theomania, or divine madness. Socrates taught that the greatest of blessings come to us through madness when it is sent as a gift of the gods. In other words, this isn't ordinary madness. Spiritual madness is an infusion of the divine that explodes man-made boundaries and mores. The philosopher Diogenes used to run around Athens naked and lived in a tub on the streets, offending polite society around him, to demonstrate what true freedom looked like. The followers of Dionysus, the Olympian god of wine, pleasure, festivity, frenzy, found freedom through transgressing social norms and became orgiasts of spiritual ecstasy. In the Islamic tradition, we have the Sufi Islam storyteller Mullah Nasruddin, who's the fool in so many Muslim teaching stories, and who turned things upside down to illustrate the ignorance and the hypocrisy of conventional thinking. In Buddhism, we have many examples of crazy wisdom masters who exploded propriety as a way of teaching the Dharma. In the 15th century, the Zen master Ikkyu used to run around his town with a human skeleton in order to spread the message of impermanence. There's the Tibetan saint Milarepa, who committed murder as a young man and whose teachings were gathered in a collection called the Songs of Craziness. Hinduism, too, has a long history of celebrating holy fools and those considered to be drunk on God. You may have heard of the 19th century Saint Sri Ramakrishna, who used to dress up in women's clothing as part of his devotion to the Divine Mother. He would chant the name of female genitalia and fall into an ecstatic trance. In fact, the bhakti path, the path of devotion, is characterized by just such abandonment and crazy seeming acts of devotion. If you go to India, you find God, drunk sadhus, and holy men everywhere you turn. And of course, they're treated as sacred beings. The most extreme crazy wisdom path of all, though, is a sect known as the Aghoris in India. The Aghoris make their homes in cremation grounds and use outrageous practices to transcend civilized norms, to actually live the unity of all things. For example, they eat their food from human skulls. They ingest dead flesh and even feces to overcome fear and disgust. In this, they break down the line between holy, unholy, clean and foul, life and death, to bring unity to the way that they live. In the Christian tradition, crazy wisdom has been present from the beginning. The prophet Isaiah walked naked and barefoot for 3 years, predicting a forthcoming captivity in Egypt, while those around him believed him to be mad in the Old Testament. In the 6th century, St. Simeon dragged a dog's corpse through the streets to represent the sort of baggage that people carry in their spiritual life. And let's not forget St. Francis, who preached in church stark naked in rebellion against materialism and hypocrisy. St. Paul described such God-drunk behavior as being fools for Christ. Fools for Christ use shocking and unconventional behavior to deliver prophecies and to challenge accepted norms. And then in Judaism, we find examples of this holy madness in the crazy behavior of the ancient Hasidic rabbis. Rabbi Rami Shapiro explains that the crazy wisdom of such rabbis, in fact, of holy people of all faiths who dare to step out of the box of conventional religion and to live without a net, is that it helps us to navigate the wildness of our own lives with grace, humor, and love. Now, the operative word here is wildness. We all know that life itself is wild. It's shocking. It's very often rude. The divine is never polite. God just laughs at our pious, egotistical presumptions. In fact, spiritual truth is non-dual. It mixes good with bad, dark with light, profane with sacred, in fluid, transcendent ways that the rational mind mostly rejects. Now, we've had many crazy wisdom teachers in the modern era, some of them notorious. Teachers whose methods, while brilliant, have also been highly controversial and often gotten them into a lot of trouble. So I'm thinking about Gurdjieff, the Russian philosopher and mystic. I'm thinking of the American adept Da Frijan, who went by many different names. And of course, the Tibetan master Chogyam Trungpa, who was the founder of the Shambhala School and the Naropa Institute. Trungpa's drunken misbehavior and crazy wisdom style created huge problems for his community, while also delivering undeniable wisdom. Besides being an active alcoholic, drug taker, womanizer, and manipulator, Trungpa was also brilliant, learned, articulate, and deeply helpful to a great many people. One of these people was Pema Chodron, the beloved Tibetan Buddhist teacher and author, who was once asked about her relationship with Trungpa and answered with a paradox. This is what Pema said. People say to me, how could you follow a teacher like that? Or how can an enlightened person do that? I do not know. I can't buy a party line where they say it was sacred activity or something like this, come up with the grounds to make it okay. But I also can't come up with grounds or a fixed idea to make it not okay. I'm really left in that I don't know. I just don't know. I can't answer the relative questions because he defied being able to answer them. Isn't that interesting? She couldn't answer the relative question of whether it was right or wrong, good or bad, because he defied being able to answer them. In other words, Trungpa's crazy wisdom teachings made it impossible for Pema to see the problem from only one side. She saw both sides of her brilliant, troubled teacher, and she knew how much of her practice she owed to him. In fact, it was Chogyam Trungpa who popularized the term crazy wisdom. In Tibetan, this teaching style is called Yesho Cholwa, which means literally wisdom gone wild. Now, wisdom is wild because spirit is wild. Spirit will not be contained by our dogmas or our petty moralities. Nor does wild wisdom always appear in the places where you're expecting to find it. For example, when I was a student at Berkeley, there was a guy we used to call the hate man, who would stand in the fountain across from Sproul Hall, often wearing women's clothing, just shouting the most horrible things at people as they passed by. But the hate man didn't actually mean any harm. It was more like spiritual performance art. His epithets were almost always directed at our middle-class pretensions and self-absorption. It was satire in the service of exposing the truth. Oh, look at her and her Ralph Lauren. Who would you be without daddy's money? Things like that. People we call mad are sometimes the wisest among us beneath their crazy exteriors. We see this in literature and in myth and in tradition. Think of Cassandra in Greek myth, who was given the gift of prophecy. And then when she turned Zeus down for his sexual favors, he made it so that no one would believe her prophecy. So she was called mad for speaking the truth. Or think of Shakespeare's plays, which are full of madmen and fools who speak the most brazen truths. From King Lear to Twelfth Night, Shakespeare gives us crazy prophets who often speak directly to the audience, a bit like sages diagnosing human folly. As Shakespeare wrote, the wisdom of God is folly, foolishness to the world. So it's often the messengers who offend us the most deeply who succeed in cracking our egoic defenses and illusions. A teacher who respects your hypocrisies or coddles your insecurities, comforts your illusions, isn't worth the zafu he's sitting on. Spoon-feeding, convention-respecting masters who want to be liked do very little to advance us on the path of freedom. Far more often, it's the severe, boundary-crossing, straight for the jugular teachers who are far more effective. Now, the most extreme example of a crazy wisdom teacher that I've known was a woman named Joyce Green, who later became known as Ma Jaya or just Joya. Joyce Green had been an Italian-American housewife in Brooklyn whose story is really hard to believe. She was a mother of 3, and she had struggled with obesity. So she took a Jack LaLanne weight loss class where she learned a breathing exercise for weight loss. While she was practicing this breathing at home, Green had a number of mystical experiences that changed her life. She claimed to have met Nityananda, Neem Karoli Baba, great Indian saints, as well as Jesus Christ himself, among others, during these experiences. So Green started meditating on a regular basis, even though she had no spiritual background. She became acquainted with a number of Western teachers, including Hilda Charlton and Ram Dass, who sang her praises to their communities. I got the chance to spend time with Ma Jaya when I was hired by a magazine to do a profile about her and her work. So I flew to Florida to visit her at her ashram, and I was completely floored by her eccentricity. Huge haired, suntanned as an alligator skin handbag. She was covered with tattoos and jewels everywhere. Joya talked like a truck driver. She had one of the filthiest mouths I've ever heard, and she gave teachings to her adoring community. She identified with the Hindu goddess Kali, who's known for murdering illusion with the sword of discernment. Kali is that blood-fanged goddess with skulls around her neck. And that's just how Joya behaved in her community. She busted balls, she stomped on egos, and she cut through devotees' BS without any mercy. She harassed, needled, teased, assaulted, and challenged her followers both verbally and physically. By the end of the first day, I was completely exhausted by all of this extremity. And I would have thought that that was all she was. I would have kind of written her off as another delusional megalomaniac guru if it hadn't been for what happened the next day. The next day, we went to do rounds at an AIDS ward near her ashram. And I stood there watching as she crawled into bed with dying patients covered with Kaposi sarcoma, stroking their heads and rocking them, kissing their hands, cooing into their ears, making them laugh. This was at a time when many people refused to even enter the room of AIDS patients, no less kiss them or hold them tight. Joya was like a warrior of love. She was absolutely fearless and fierce. And in fact, to this day, that was one of the most moving examples of radical passion and spiritual power that I've ever seen. To be with her was transformative and liberating. She behaved in the world like Shakti incarnate. But it was also true that behind her crazy wisdom, Joya was simply psychologically crazy. And over time, her extreme practices devolved into genuine abuse. Many of her close students left her. Her behavior became more erratic. Ram Dass wrote a famous essay called Egg on My Beard to apologize to the public for having promoted her. But none of this erases the good that Joya did or the force of love that she wielded when she was in alignment. Teachers do not need to be perfect for us to learn from them. If that were true, nobody would learn anything. The fact is that sometimes we learn by the via negativa. We learn how not to behave, who not to become. We tell ourselves, this isn't what I signed up for, but how do we know that that's not what we signed up for on a spiritual level? Now, I'm not excusing abuse by crazy wisdom teachers in any way, okay? But it does have both good and bad in it as a path. And our purpose today is to see what it might have to teach us. So, the great strength of this particular path is that it helps to shake up our taboos and our shibboleths. It helps us to question our assumptions and to shock ourselves into living with the truth. As Rami Shapiro says, ours is a time in desperate need of crazy wisdom. As religious and ethnic groups circle their wagons against one another, as people prepare to pit their gods in pitched battle against each other, we need to hear the God intoxicated teachings of those who see the madness of the conventional and offer us the sanity of the crazy, unquote. Isn't that great? I'd just like to repeat that. Ours is a time in desperate need of crazy wisdom. As religious and ethnic groups circle their wagons against one another and people prepare to pit their gods in pitched battle against each other, we need to hear the God intoxicated teachings of those who see the madness of the conventional and offer us the sanity of the crazy. Isn't that great? Now, this sanity of the crazy begins with paradox. To be alive as a spiritual being in a physical body is to have the absurdity of experience forever on display, to have it front and center. The fact is, you are both a manifestation of the power of God, a Buddha or a Christ in the making, as well as a monkey that squats to relieve itself, that chokes and sputters and acts like a beast. The psychologist Erich Fromm wrote, "The problem of man's existence is unique in the whole of nature. He is partly divine, partly animal, partly infinite, partly finite." So every one of us is a holy fool. We're a platypus of mismatched parts. We see the world through two different lenses, the eye of the body and the eye of God, the micro and the macro, the relative and the transcendent, the personal and the transpersonal. These lenses offer antithetical perspectives on the same truth. And the point where they meet in the human being is funny, is absurd, that we're lopsided, we're contradictory, we're upside down. And that lopsidedness, that absurdity, forces us to laugh at ourselves in all of our nakedness. And this is an important point because nakedness is integral to crazy wisdom as a kind of spiritual device for cutting through shame and pretense. Let me just repeat that. Nakedness, both emotional and physical, is integral to crazy wisdom as a spiritual device for cutting through shame and pretense. It's really important. Bodily nakedness invites spiritual nakedness. It's harder to be guarded, dishonest, pretentious, or uncaring when your toches, as my grandmother would call it, is hanging out for the world to see. When I was a teenager, I used to go to a nude beach on the California coast. And though I couldn't have explained it clearly then, the unusual quality of friendliness, connection, conversation, and hilarity that I found there were undoubtedly connected to the absence of clothing. In spiritual and healing practices, crazy wisdom teachers employ the power of nakedness to help awaken their students. There are many stories of Trungpa, of Da Frijan, of Werner Erhard, the creator of Est, using forced nakedness as a teaching tool. Now, this is a very slippery slope between instruction and abuse, obviously. One particularly hair-raising story involved Trungpa and the poet W.S. Merwin and his wife who had come to participate in a retreat. But despite the fact that Merwin was assaulted by Trungpa's devotees and even came to blows with one of them who was trying to strip him while Trungpa looked on, Merwin wound up staying for the rest of the retreat because he didn't want to miss Trungpa's teaching. So, however offensive, transgressive, or bizarre the tactics of crazy wisdom teachers might be, they also have a lot to teach us. So, I'd like to just go through 5 particular qualities that this path seeks to strengthen and 5 that it aims to destroy. Let's start with wildness. In addition to nakedness, crazy wisdom exposes us to the wild power of spirit. And this is something that we need a lot in our virtual, convenience-obsessed culture. When we lose touch with the wildness of who we are, our original, untamed, undomesticated nature, we lose vitality. We also divorce ourselves from raw, unmediated experience. And that's why we need, for example, to stay connected to nature, spend time in nature, because it resonates with our own internal wildness. The next quality that crazy wisdom strengthens is humor. The one thing that every holy person I have ever met shares is humor. They love to laugh. Our human follies, including their own, are completely hilarious to them. Now, making fun of ourselves is different from self-loathing. This is important because we mock ourselves lovingly, not to put ourselves down, but to dispel our illusions. Our egos we see are just completely ridiculous, transparent, even dispensable in the eyes of crazy wisdom. And that leads to the next gift of this path, which is acceptance, which is also tied to humility. Being able to see ourselves in the 360, in the round, and not push anything away, no matter how much we dislike it. You're not meant to be perfect, you're meant to be you. Every tree leans one way or the other. Are they all deformed or are they just themselves? Now, the next gift of the crazy wisdom path is shamelessness. And I've talked about this a lot in the Seeker's Forum. It's a much underrated quality in spiritual life, shamelessness. Transcending the neurotic, ego-bound shame that keeps us enclosed in appearance and illusion. Now, shame as a moral emotion when we do something wrong is different. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the shame that keeps us bound in masks and personas that keep us small and shrink us and don't allow our spiritual power, our spiritual presence to show. The final gift of crazy wisdom is its direct line to unity consciousness. There's something to be said for extremity as a tool, not as a steady diet, when it comes to shattering the ego's stubborn, thick skin. When I think of the big ahas in my personal life, many of them have come in moments of embarrassment, exposure, and extreme discomfort. That's when the walls of separation are shattered and truth is present. And that's what leads to unity consciousness, when we can't hold on to our illusions and we look at ourselves in the whole as the whole. Now, as for the qualities that crazy wisdom targets or wants to get rid of, the first, of course, is hypocrisy. Our tendency to lie to ourselves and others, to assume false roles, to cover the truth with stories. We're all a little hypocritical in some area of our lives. It comes from being dual-natured. So we may not be able to rid ourselves completely of hypocrisy, but we can be aware of it and how it limits and distorts us. The next thing crazy wisdom aims at is the sense of separation. If I'm naked, wild, shameless, and unmasked, I know that I'm no better than anyone else. I know I'm connected to all that exists. I'm present, not lost in a story and some version of myself. With practice, we come to be able to stabilize the ability to be in this non-separate space. The next thing crazy wisdom does away with is pride. Not the pride in being glad to be ourselves, do good things, work toward excellence, but the pride of specialness, entitlement, privilege, and greed. It's important to remember that entitlement, privilege, and greed don't have anything necessarily to do with our finances, right? It's an emotional posture toward the world, a feeling like life owes us something. This kind of entitlement is connected to self-pity, which also starts to go as we practice the crazy wisdom path. The next quality is piety, which is all about form and misses the substance. Piety reveres appearances, the letter of the law, obedience, repetition, tradition, judgmental values. Piety has very little to do with spirituality. In fact, no bona fide mystic or awakened person is ever pious. Piety has pride in it, and the sense of knowing the one true way, which is never the way that enlightened masters or any authentic non-dual teaching presents itself. And the last quality that crazy wisdom seeks to rid us of is vanity. Crazy wisdom is a kind of bonfire of the vanities. We're asked to toss our illusions one by one into the fire of truth and just watch them go up in flames. We're asked to strip ourselves of our worldly skin and move as naked spirit through the world, laughing at our own idiocies. It's a harsh, aggressive, sometimes cruel, but spiritually powerful practice if it's used in small doses with discernment and mindfulness. So that's what I wanted to say to you today about crazy wisdom. And why don't we pull up the prompt, Jay, and we'll just do 15 minutes of writing. I'd like you now, please take 15 minutes to write about whether there are areas in your own life where you are hypocritical. If so, what are they and why? And if not, how do you maintain such alignment? Where are your hypocrisy points? Almost all of us have them. Be as specific as you can be, please. We'll take 15 minutes and then we'll come back together as a group.